Welcome back. We've now reached our final chapter, quite literally, in the story of the written Constitution. I say quite literally because, as you'll recall, we're walking through the written Constitution in textual order, and in the process we're also tracking a book that I did in 2005 called America's Constitution, a Biography. And that book tracks the flow of the text, which is in turn chronologically laid out. We started with the founding era, the original Constitution, followed very quickly by the first 10 amendments, the so-called Bill of Rights, a judiciary limiting 11th Amendment, and a pro-populist, pro-partisan presidency, pro-democracy, but alas also pro-slavery 12th Amendment, codifying kind of the Jeffersonian vision of the presidency, and that brought the founding era to a close, the original Constitution and the first 12 amendments. Then we moved forward in time, and after the Civil War, we encountered the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, ending slavery and guaranteeing civil and eventually political equality to African Americans. More recently, we've flashed forward yet again and focused on the amendments of the progressive era, the beginning of the 20th century. We focused particular attention on the 16th, 17th, and 19th Amendments from that era: income tax, direct election of senators, and women's suffrage. Today and in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the more modern amendments, the late 20th century amendments. And as I said, that's the last chapter of the book, America's Constitution, a Biography. But before we talk about the late 20th century amendments, you might have thought that I gave short shrift to the 18th and the 21st Amendments from the early 20th century, the 18th enacting prohibition and the 21st repealing it. And if you thought that, you were right. I did kind of breeze by those because the 21st basically, in effect, undoes the 18th. I can't cover everything in exquisite detail in these lectures. If you do want more background on those amendments or on virtually anything else that we discuss in this online course, the book has lots more detail on that. But I thought I should say just a word or two about the 18th and the 21st before moving forward. The 18th Amendment was part of the progressive era, and those who supported prohibition saw it as consistent with, many of those who supported it saw it as very consistent with the other reforms of the era, an era that gave us initiative and referendum and recall, the political primaries, a kind of a democratic reform, direct election of senators. This was an era that was in which a lot of social energy was spent sort of resisting forces of corruption, corporate corruption, city bosses. State legislatures were seen as somewhat corrupt in the way they picked senators, often taking bribes and the like, so direct election of senators was a kind of clean government reform. It turns out that in order to run clean elections, that requires a lot of money too, campaign contributions, but maybe that money is spread around in ad campaigns directed at the populace rather than slipped into the pockets of state legislators. But direct election of senators was a kind of reform. And women's suffrage, of course. Prohibition was also seen as a reform of sorts. The saloons in big cities were seen as particularly corrupt places. There's a feminist angle to the whole thing. Many women felt that men, especially working men, were getting their wages on Friday afternoon, going to the saloon, drinking down their wages rather than bringing the money home to their wives and kids. And instead, because they had been drinking too much at the saloon, they would come home and beat up their wives and kids. That was a stereotype or an image that fueled the prohibition movement, and it was a movement strongly supported by women. Remember, maybe from the history books, a famous organization you might have heard of, the Women Christian Temperance Union. And indeed, one of the major forces that lobbied against women's suffrage was the liquor lobby. because they feared that women's suffrage would actually lead to prohibition, lead to dry laws. And indeed, the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment are coming from the same era. Prohibition also had a national security angle. There was a need for grain during World War I, and people said, well, grain is being diverted to make beer and other things. So I did want to just briefly mention prohibition, since I gave it short shrift last time. It's the one amendment, really, of all of them that arguably restricts liberty and equality. And interestingly, it's the one that doesn't take. Shortly after prohibition is passed in the 19-teens, it's repealed in the early 1930s. So, and that's the 21st Amendment. And that's one of the reasons I didn't spend so much time on it, because the 21st, in effect, cancels out the 18th. But one interesting question is, how is it, from a process point of view, that an amendment could be passed? Remember, it requires 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states, and yet so quickly thereafter you get 2/3, 2/3, 3/4 for the exact opposite position. How could that swing happen so soon? And one factor, I think, is that this was an era, the early 20th century, of democratic experimentation. The progressives believed in progress. They believed in trying things, but also learning from the data. And many people considered prohibition a failed experiment. It was designed to stamp out the corruption of the saloon. It didn't do that at all. It just drove liquor underground, speakeasies, and a lot of organized crime. By the time of the Great Depression, a lot of people just wanted and perhaps needed a drink from time to time. And if you repealed prohibition and brought this industry back into the daylight, you could tax it, and that would be a source of government revenue, a sorely needed revenue. So some people who supported prohibition in the 19-teens, some politicians actually changed their minds. So you can look at the votes, and you can see some people who voted both for prohibition and its repeal. But another factor is that prohibition emerged from a somewhat malapportioned system. Cities tended to be wet, pro-liquor. Counties tended to be dry, anti-liquor, prohibitionist. And in the early 20th century, lots of state legislatures were malapportioned. Many House districts were malapportioned. And so in this malapportionment, the counties counted for, the rural counties counted for more than their fair share. The cities got short shrift. They weren't really proportionally represented. The urban areas, which were wet, more immigrant, more pro-liquor. And so the process that generated the 18th Amendment was one that kind of overweighted rural areas in the ratification process, and even in the House of Representatives. By the time of the 21st Amendment, however, Congress, for the first and only time, said, we want this amendment to be ratified not by state legislatures, but by specially elected conventions of the citizenry. And those specially elected conventions were, in effect, in many places, adopted one person, one vote statewide. So there wasn't the kind of malapportionment. So cities played a bigger role in that process. So with both direct election of senators and the 21st Amendment, we see an anticipation of the one person, one vote idea. Remember, when senators are picked by state legislatures and state legislatures are malapportioned, then the Senate is basically a feature of that malapportioned system. But with the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, you count all the voters in the state equally, one person, one vote, and so the Senate itself is a one person, one vote idea, and so too the process that generated the 21st Amendment involved one person, one vote. It's also possible that ordinary people are more willing to just sort of vote openly for liquor, whereas some politicians state legislators. So in the convention, basically, they're not ordinary politicians there. It's kind of like a referendum of sorts, and people vote their preferences. They want to drink. But politicians and state legislatures, even though they may occasionally have a drink or two themselves on the sly, they might have hesitated to vote for liquor, to be seen as soft on morality or something like that. So there's sometimes a possibility that ordinary voters might have sort of different tendencies than the professional politicians. Okay, so that was the 18th and the 21st. But now let's carry the story forward in time. Recall that virtually all the amendments that we've had have come in generational spurts or clusters. In the founding era, the first 12, beginning shortly after the Constitution is ratified and ending in Thomas Jefferson's first administration, the 12th Amendment. 12 amendments, 10 in the Bill of Rights, an 11th limiting the judiciary, and a 12th modifying the rules of the Electoral College. That's the founding generation's amendments. And then you have the Civil War, Reconstruction generation's amendments, 13, 14, 15. Then you have this spurt of amendments in the 19-teens carrying forward to the repeal of Prohibition in the early 1930s. And the final set of amendments were all ratified in a generational, a later generational spurt, pretty much. The next spurt is really going to be 1960s. But there's one standalone amendment, kind of that's worth mentioning. And then the final amendment is a little tricky, so I'll tell you about that tomorrow in the next lecture. But the two-term amendment, the 22nd Amendment, kind of stands alone chronologically. It's ratified in 1951, so it's almost 20 years after the lame duck amendment and the repeal of Prohibition, which is early on in Franklin Roosevelt's administration. So 20 years basically after the last set of amendments and 10 years before the next cluster, this two-term amendment kind of just stands out there on its own chronologically. And let's talk about that amendment. Remember that the original Constitution on paper allows for a president to be perpetually re-elected. Every 4 years he has to come before the electorate, and 4 years means absolute 4 years. Come hell or high water, we hold presidential elections in the middle of civil wars and world wars and Great Depressions. That's not true in an English parliamentary system where the elections can sometimes be pushed back. And in fact, in World War II, basically Parliament postponed elections. There basically was no election at all, a regular parliamentary election in England between 1935 and 1945. But in America, we held elections on schedule every 4 years for the presidency. Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, submits to the voters' judgment. But under the founders' written Constitution, presidents are perpetually re-eligible. But as we talked about before, George Washington set all sorts of important precedents. And one of the most important is that he stepped down after 2 terms. He would have been re-elected had he stood for a 3rd term. He was unanimously picked the first time around in 1789. He was unanimously re-elected in 1792. He would have been unanimously or virtually unanimously re-elected, but he stepped down. And he didn't say a lot about it, but later Americans came to understand that Washington was sending a signal that the republic needs to be bigger than any one person, and that he was kind of in part sending that message that other people are perfectly capable of carrying the torch. And indeed, when Thomas Jefferson wins re-election, he steps down after his 2nd term and says explicitly, I don't think we should have, in effect, a lifetime presidency. John Adams, of course, runs for re-election and loses, so it's not really an issue for him. But when Thomas Jefferson wins his 2nd term, at the end of that, he declines to run again. And remember, in the states, governors that were governorships that had no term limits to them, the governors were almost always re-elected, basically, until they died or were close to death. John Hancock in Massachusetts, George Clinton in New York, Trumbull in Connecticut, also in New Jersey. Governors who could run for re-election ran again and again and again and were almost always elected. But Jefferson didn't like that model, so he said, like Washington, I think I should step down after 2 terms. After Jefferson, James Madison did the same thing. James Monroe did the same thing. John Quincy Adams runs for re-election and loses. Andrew Jackson, after 2 terms, steps down. Thus, a tradition emerges. It's not in the text, but it's a tradition of 2 terms. Now, that tradition isn't inviolable. The next president who gets reelected, Abraham Lincoln, is assassinated, so we never know whether he would have chosen to follow that example or not. McKinley also is assassinated in his 2nd term, so we don't know. We do know that there were some presidents who did dream, at least, of 3rd terms. It's a little cheeky, though, given the tradition. If you're basically saying, well, I'm greater than General Jackson and General Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison because, I'm going to seek a 3rd term even though they didn't. But Ulysses Grant, after 2 terms, steps down following the Washington precedent. And Grant is in a lot of ways like George Washington, this general above political party. He steps down, but then 4 years later, he gets the itch and he kind of runs again. And maybe you see the tradition is not so clear. Is it that no 3rd term or no 3rd consecutive term? There's an ambiguity in this unwritten tradition. So Grant steps down and but runs in the Republican process, the Republican convention. 4 years later, doesn't get it. Grover Cleveland, he wins. Then he loses his bid for re-election. Then he runs again and wins, so he now has 2 terms. And he dreams of a 3rd term. It wouldn't be a 3rd consecutive term. It would be a 3rd total term, but only a 2nd consecutive term. But the Democratic Party isn't interested in having him. There's another issue unresolved in the tradition. How do you count partial terms? Teddy Roosevelt basically has 3 years as president when McKinley dies. Then he wins in his own right. Can he run for a 2nd term in his own right? 2 full terms as president, plus in early 3s. Well, he decides not to. But then 4 years later, and Taft becomes president, but 4 years later, Teddy Roosevelt gets the itch again, and he runs and he says, yeah, when I said I didn't want a 3rd term, I meant a 3rd consecutive term. If I said I didn't want a 3rd cup of coffee, no one would think that I was forever giving up the beverage. So he runs, loses. Woodrow Wilson is dreaming of a 3rd term even after his stroke. So the tradition is ambiguous in certain respects, how to think about 3rd terms, how to think about non-consecutive terms. And of course, famously, Franklin Roosevelt serves not 2, not 3, but he actually serves into his 4th term. He dies early in his 4th term, but he runs for a 3rd term and gets reelected for that 3rd term, and runs for a 4th term and gets reelected. And in the wake of that, the 2-term amendment, the 22nd Amendment, emerges. And it's kind of a retrospective rebuke, to some extent, of the Roosevelt precedent. It's saying, never again should one person make himself so indispensable. And remember, this is emerging in a world where there's anxiety about other strong leaders around the world, Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini. And so people say, American democracy should never be organized around one indispensable man, the fearless leader, the big brother. So the critique is that we shouldn't have, basically, presidencies for life. The folks on the other side say, well, it's up to the voters to decide. We have elections, and if you don't want the fellow, vote against him. And the believer in presidential term limits say, no, but a president, as a practical matter, can entrench himself in all sorts of ways and make himself an indispensable leader. And so in the name of democracy, we're going to limit presidential terms. And interestingly, once the federal government does that, a bunch of states follow suit for governorships. Many states, though, prohibit just more than 2 consecutive terms, but they allow non-consecutive 3rd and even 4th terms. But once again, we see a very interesting interplay between state constitutions and the federal constitution. State the Constitution was modeled on state constitutions to some extent. It created, and in turn was copied by state constitutions. Constitution, in particular the presidency, created a very strong executive branch, and then states started to reconfigure at the founding their governorships to look more like presidents. 4-year terms, veto pens, pardon pens became much more common at the state gubernatorial level after Article II had put forth that model. And so, too, after the Constitution, the federal Constitution is amended to add term limits for the presidency. A bunch of state constitutions add term limits for governorships. Now, these term limits create very interesting incentives, and I'm going to close actually with this lecture with a conversation about sort of what happens when you term limit the executive. Well, one thing maybe you see is that we've seen is actually presidents in their second terms are weakened. They're lame ducks from day one, and so their enemies can come out and attack them, knowing that they're not going to even be able to threaten to run on a third term and vanquish their foes. And so we've seen in second-term presidencies recently Richard Nixon resigning in disgrace under the threat of impeachment, Bill Clinton actually being impeached, not convicted, but impeached. Ronald Reagan having Iran being wounded politically in Iran-Contra in his second term. George W. Bush kind of limping along a bit in his second term. We'll see how the Obama second term runs. But one feature structurally is that the two-term amendment makes a president a lame duck at the beginning of the second term. At the state level, sometimes term-limited governors have run their wives. In effect, vote for Lurleen Wallace for George Wallace's additional term, and Ma Ferguson in Texas, and so that's been a strategy that sometimes has occurred at the state level. But the final thing I want to talk about at the federal level is how this weakening of the presidency through the two-term amendment has actually empowered vice presidents. If a president can't run for a third term on his own, but he can run, in effect, by proxy by picking his wingman, his vice president, to be his third term. And before the two-term amendment, you didn't see vice presidents really weren't very significant. They were significant at the founding, because remember, at the founding, at the very, very beginning, the vice president is the guy who comes in second for the presidency. So John Adams is someone substantial. So was Thomas Jefferson. They ran for the presidency, but came in second. But remember, the 12th Amendment lets you vote separately for president and vice president. It creates a ticket system, and after the 12th Amendment, vice presidents basically are really not typically very important political figures. There are one or two who are significant, but generally not. But after the 22nd Amendment, vice presidents kind of begin to come into their own. Between the 12th Amendment and the 22nd Amendment, the two-term amendment, only about 15% of vice presidents ever won their party nomination for the presidency itself. They weren't sort of major figures. But since the two-term amendment, more than half of them vice presidents have actually won the party nomination for presidency later on. At the end of the 20th century, I think 5 resigning presidents all sort of watched their wingman, their vice president, sort of run for president in his own right. So Eisenhower watched Nixon run, and Johnson watched Humphrey run for president, his vice president, and Richard Nixon, who had resigned already, watched Gerald Ford run, and Reagan watched George H.W. Bush run, and Clinton watched Gore run and win, again, the party nomination. So one of the important stories of the 22nd Amendment has been how it's actually strengthened the political tag team between president and vice president. Vice presidents become presidents' wingmen, and the way, in effect, in the modern era, you win a third term, you become like Franklin Roosevelt, is not by running and winning in your own right, but having your hand-picked successor run. George H.W. Bush, that was Reagan's third term on this interpretation. Now, two of the themes that we've talked about today, one person, one vote, and the tag team between president and vice president are going to be themes we're also going to see in the last round of amendments from the 1960s, and that's going to be the story I'm going to tell you in the next lecture. So hope to see you.